The priest did not speak of what he experienced that night. In the morning, he told the abbess only that the convent required stricter discipline, that the sisters had grown lax, that fear was spreading because boundaries had weakened. His voice was calm, authoritative, almost reassuring, but his face was pale, and his eyes avoided the far end of the corridor where the shadows still seemed too deep for daylight. What he did not say was that the footsteps had followed him all the way to his room, not rushed, not aggressive, measured, as if whoever walked behind him already knew he could not escape. He had felt it clearly then, not a presence seeking attention, but one demanding recognition. The disturbances intensified after his visit. Candles went out without wind. Doors were found open that had been locked from the inside. Sisters woke with the distinct sensation of hands resting lightly on their shoulders, not pressing, not restraining, only reminding them they were not alone. When they screamed, nothing was there. When they prayed, the feeling lingered. Sleep became fractured. Dreams bled into waking hours. Sisters reported seeing faces they did not recognize, but somehow knew intimately. Women wearing habits from older centuries, torn hems, stained sleeves, eyes that did not accuse, yet did not forgive either. The convent's response hardened. The abbess ordered silence about the apparitions. Anyone who spoke of them was assigned penance. Fear, she insisted, was contagious. The sisters were warned that speaking gave the spirits power. If they existed at all, they existed because attention sustained them, and yet silence only sharpened the encounters. Sister Eliza vanished for several hours one afternoon. She was found later in the unused wing of the convent, kneeling before a sealed door no one remembered leading anywhere. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. When they pulled her away, her hands were bleeding from pressing against the stone. "She asked me why we stayed," Eliza whispered later. "Why we kept praying instead of listening." The door was bricked shut that same evening. Miriam watched all of this with growing certainty. The fear gripping the convent was not random. The spirits did not appear where faith was weakest. They appeared where silence was strongest, where records were missing, where rooms had been repurposed too quickly, where questions had once been buried beneath obedience. She began spending time in the archives again, this time at night, despite the rules. Old ledgers, incomplete files, names crossed out with no explanation, transfers noted without destinations, margins filled with language so vague it bordered on erasure. As she read, the air in the room grew colder. Not suddenly, gradually. She felt it then, a presence standing beside her, not behind, beside, close enough that she could sense fabric brushing against fabric. Miriam did not look up immediately. She already knew. When she finally did, she saw a woman standing where the shadows pooled deepest. Her face was visible now, young, exhausted, familiar in a way that defied memory. "You remember us," the woman said, her voice barely audible, like breath moving through stone. Miriam nodded. Her throat tightened, but she did not step back. "We were told to endure," the spirit continued. "We were told silence was holy. We were told obedience would save us." The air thickened. More figures emerged, not fully formed, but present enough to be felt. They did not surround Miriam. They waited. "What do you want?" Miriam asked. "To be named," the woman replied. "To be seen, to stop being explained away." The next morning, Miriam was summoned before the abbess and the priest. They accused her of stirring unrest, of encouraging delusion, of allowing darkness to masquerade as truth. The priest warned her that spirits lied, that demons mimicked the wounded to deceive the faithful. Miriam listened without interruption. Then she said something no one had ever said aloud in that room. "What if they are not demons?" she asked calmly. "But witnesses?" The room went silent. The priest's hand tightened around his rosary. The abbess's expression hardened, not with anger, but with fear. Not fear of the supernatural, but fear of what acknowledgement would require. That night, the bells rang without being pulled, and for the first time the spirits did not linger quietly. They walked openly through the corridors, and they were no longer content with being unseen. The bells rang again just before midnight, not in the measured rhythm of prayer, but in uneven bursts, as if pulled by hands unfamiliar with their weight. The sound tore through the convent, waking every sister at once. Doors opened. Footsteps echoed. No one spoke. They did not need to. The air itself felt crowded, dense with something that did not belong to the living alone. The priest rushed into the corridor, robe hastily thrown over his shoulders, rosary clutched tightly in his hand. He began to pray aloud, his voice sharp, forceful, each word spoken like a command. The sound of the bells faltered, then stopped. For a moment, there was hope. Then the whispers began. They did not come from one direction. They rose from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Dozens of voices overlapping, not shouting, not pleading, recounting, names spoken softly, dates, small details of daily life long forgotten, chores, punishments, confessions that had led nowhere. The sisters pressed their hands to their ears, but the sound was not entering through hearing alone. It moved through memory. Several fell to their knees. The priest shouted for silence. He raised his voice higher, invoking authority, invoking God, invoking order. His words did not falter, but his confidence did. The whispers did not stop. They did not challenge him. They ignored him entirely. That was when the first figure appeared fully. She stood at the far end of the corridor, illuminated by moonlight spilling through a high window. Her habit was old, the fabric frayed and darkened, as if it had absorbed decades of damp stone and unanswered prayer. Her face was calm, not wrathful, not mournful, simply present. She took one step forward. The priest recoiled instinctively, the rosary slipping through his fingers. He whispered a command for her to leave. She did not respond. Instead, she turned her gaze to the sisters behind him. "You were told we disappeared," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly through the corridor. "You were told we were weak." Another figure emerged beside her, then another, and another. They formed no line, no formation. They stood where they wished, filling the space with a quiet inevitability. "We stayed," one of them said. "We endured. And when endurance failed, we were erased." The abbess appeared then, pale and rigid, flanked by two senior sisters. She demanded order. She demanded obedience. She demanded silence. Her voice shook, only slightly, but it was enough. The spirits turned toward her. "You sealed the doors," one said gently. "You closed the books. You taught them to forget." The abbess's lips trembled. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. Miriam stood apart from the others, her heart pounding but her feet steady. She felt the weight of the moment pressing on her chest, not as fear, but as responsibility. The spirits did not look at her as judge or savior. They looked at her as witness. "What happens now?" Miriam asked quietly. The figures shifted. Some faces blurred, others sharpened. "We do not seek punishment," the first woman said. "We seek acknowledgement, to be named, to be written back into what was stolen." The priest found his voice again. He shouted that this was deception, that spirits demanded attention to feed on fear, that the sisters must look away, must pray harder, must not listen. As he spoke, one of the spirits stepped closer. "You taught them obedience," she said. "We teach them memory." The corridor grew colder. Candles extinguished one by one. until only moonlight remained. The living and the dead stood together in that pale light, separated not by distance, but by what they were willing to see. Miriam understood then that the haunting was not an invasion. It was a reckoning. The convent had been built on silence, layered over silence, obedience stacked upon obedience. What had been buried had not rotted. It had waited. And now it demanded space. As the spirits began to move again, opening sealed doors, standing before forgotten rooms, tracing names into dust with deliberate hands, the sisters realized something terrifying and undeniable. The dead were not here to destroy the convent. They were here to make it remember. And once memory returned, nothing could remain unchanged. By morning, the convent no longer felt sealed off from time. Sunlight entered places it never had before, striking corners that had remained dim for decades. Doors once kept locked stood open, their hinges stiff with disuse. The sisters moved slowly, cautiously, as if afraid that one wrong step might shatter whatever fragile boundary now existed between the living and the dead. The spirits did not vanish with daylight. They lingered in the periphery, visible only when someone stopped trying not to see. A figure reflected briefly in a window, a presence seated in an empty pew, a hand resting on a banister that no one touched anymore. They did not interfere. They did not threaten. They waited. The abbess ordered the convent closed to the outside world. No visitors, no deliveries. The town was told that a period of deep spiritual retreat was underway. The explanation was accepted without question. It always was. The city had learned long ago not to ask what happened behind stone walls. Inside, however, control was slipping. The priest insisted on an immediate cleansing ritual. He spoke of infestation, of spiritual contamination, of forces that must be expelled before they spread further. He demanded absolute obedience, uninterrupted prayer, fasting, silence. His voice grew sharper as resistance grew quieter, because the sisters were no longer afraid in the same way. Fear had fractured. Some still trembled, clinging to routine as protection. Others felt something else stirring beneath the terror. Recognition, grief, anger long postponed. The spirits had not accused them. They had reminded them. Sister Agnes refused to kneel during the next Mass. When questioned, she said only that she could not pray over bones that had never been named. Her punishment was immediate: isolation, penance, silence. But as she was led away, a spirit walked beside her, visible to several sisters now, calm, steady, unafraid. That was when the shift became irreversible. The spirits began to speak more clearly, not in chorus, but individually. They told their stories not as confessions, but as records, names, dates, small injustices that had accumulated into erasure. A sister transferred after reporting harm. Another reassigned after questioning authority. One who fell ill and was left alone until she stopped breathing. Each story different, each pattern the same. Miriam documented everything. She wrote at night, by candlelight, her hands steady despite exhaustion. She used old ledgers, margins, scraps of paper. Wherever there was space, she filled it with names that had been crossed out, lives that had been condensed into footnotes or omitted entirely. The spirits stood near her as she worked, never touching, never guiding her hand. They did not need to. Memory, once permitted, knew where to go. The abbess confronted her. She accused Miriam of sacrilege, of destabilizing sacred order, of elevating suffering above doctrine. Her voice broke when she spoke of what acknowledgement would mean: investigations, exposure, loss of authority, loss of trust, loss of the convent itself. Miriam listened. Then she said something that cut deeper than defiance. "You already lost it. she said quietly. "You just refused to notice." The priest demanded Miriam be removed immediately. He claimed she was the focal point, the one through whom the disturbances intensified. If she left, the spirits would follow. They always attached themselves to the weak. As if summoned by the lie, the spirits gathered. They stood behind Miriam, not protectively, not threateningly, but undeniably. Witnesses aligned with witness. "We were never attached to her," one said. "We were attached to what you buried." The priest faltered. His certainty fractured visibly now. He had authority, language, ritual. What he did not have was memory, and memory was no longer optional. The bells rang once more, this time clearly, evenly, pulled by no visible hand. One by one, the sisters realized the truth that could no longer be denied. The haunting would not end with exile. It would not end with prayer. It would not end with silence. It would end only when the convent chose to remember fully or collapse under the weight of what it refused to name. And as the spirits waited, patient as stone, Miriam understood that the question was no longer whether the convent was haunted. It was whether it was willing to survive being seen. The decision did not come all at once. It never did. Instead, it arrived in fractures. A sister who refused to destroy a page Miriam had written. Another who quietly slipped her a bundle of old keys. Someone who left a candle burning in a corridor that had long been kept dark. Small acts, barely visible on their own, but together, they shifted the balance. Obedience had relied on isolation. Memory, once shared, became difficult to contain. The priest tried one final ritual. He gathered the sisters in the chapel at night, insisting that collective prayer would break whatever hold the spirits had. The doors were locked from the inside. Candles were arranged in strict symmetry. His voice echoed as he began the litany, louder than necessary, sharp with desperation. The spirits did not interrupt. They stood among the sisters, visible now to almost all of them. Some stood where they had once prayed. Others leaned against pillars, hands folded the way they had learned in life. They did not mock the ritual. They did not resist it. They waited. As the priest's voice rose, something in it cracked. The words continued, but the authority behind them thinned. He faltered when he reached a passage about purity and obedience, his mouth shaping. The sounds while his eyes fixed on a woman standing near the altar. Her face was bruised, her habit torn at the shoulder. He knew her, not personally, administratively. He had signed the document that reassigned her. He had accepted the explanation that followed. He had moved on. She stepped forward. "I confessed," she said calmly. "I was told to pray harder." The priest dropped the book. The sound echoed louder than the bells ever had. The abbess rose slowly from her seat. Her hands trembled, not with fear of the spirits, but with the weight of what had been held back for so long. She looked at Miriam, then at the figures filling the chapel, then at the sisters whose faces no longer reflected blind obedience, but something more dangerous: recognition. She spoke at last, her voice barely carrying. "Open the records." No one moved at first. Then one sister did, then another. The keys were passed, doors unlocked, cabinets opened, pages pulled from hiding places they had been sealed into years ago. The archive room filled with people for the first time in decades. The spirits moved among them as names were spoken aloud. Each name changed the air. Some spirits faded as their stories were told, not vanishing abruptly, but softening, as if finally permitted to rest. Others remained, waiting still. Their presence made it clear: acknowledgement was not selective. It was not symbolic. It was total, or it was nothing. The priest left before dawn. He did not announce his departure. His room was simply empty. The rosary lay on the table, abandoned. Authority, stripped of silence, had nothing left to stand on. When the town learned fragments of the truth weeks later, the reaction was swift and familiar. Denial, outrage, reverence for the institution threatened. Miriam was named a disruptor. The spirits were reframed as hysteria. The convent was placed under review, language carefully chosen to minimize damage. But something had already broken open. The sisters were no longer contained by fear. Some left. Some stayed. Some spoke publicly for the first time. Others chose quieter paths, carrying memory without spectacle. There was no single ending, no resolution neat enough to preserve comfort. On the final night before Miriam departed the convent for the last time, she returned to the chapel alone. Only one spirit remained. The first woman who had spoken to her in the archives stood near the altar, her form now faint, almost translucent. "Thank you," she said. Miriam shook her head gently. "I didn't save anything." The woman smiled, a small human expression that belonged to the living as much as the dead. "No," she agreed. "You remembered." When Miriam stepped outside, the air felt lighter, not free of pain, but free of denial. The bells were silent. They would ring again someday, but never the same way. Behind her, the convent stood exposed to time at last, and Miriam walked away knowing that the haunting had never been about spirits seeking vengeance. It had been about truth refusing to remain buried. And once truth was seen, it could no longer haunt. It could only change what remained. Miriam did not rush her departure. She moved through the convent slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what had finally been allowed to surface. The corridors no longer felt crowded. The air no longer pressed against her chest. The spirits who had remained were gone now, not erased, not dismissed, but integrated into memory where they belonged. Their absence was not emptiness, it was completion. The sisters who stayed avoided speaking in absolutes. They no longer said always or never. They spoke carefully, aware now of how language could bury as much as it revealed. Some of them would leave in time. Others would remain and try to rebuild something fragile and unfinished. Miriam knew better than to judge which choice was braver. Survival took many forms. Outside the walls, the town continued its familiar rhythm. Shops opened. Bells from other churches rang on schedule. People argued about what had happened, about who was to blame, about whether it was exaggerated, misinterpreted, or invented entirely. Institutions preferred confusion to clarity. Confusion bought time. Miriam did not stay to correct the narrative. She understood now that truth did not need her constant defense. It needed space to exist. Those who were ready would find it. Those who were not would protect themselves with doubt. Both responses were predictable. Neither defined her work. As she walked away, she felt no triumph. What she felt was alignment. The fear that had once lived in her body had loosened its grip, not because the world was safer, but because she no longer needed permission to see clearly. The paranormal had never been separate from the moral. The spirits had not arrived to terrify. They had arrived because silence had reached its limit. Miriam understood something then with absolute clarity. Hauntings did not begin with the dead. They began with what the living refused to name. Where truth was buried, it pressed upward. Where memory was erased, it returned. Where obedience replaced conscience, something always came back to demand balance. She carried that knowledge with her as she stepped into a life that would never again be simple, but would always be whole. The convent would be remembered differently now. The city would resist that memory. History would argue with itself, as it always did. But Miriam no longer measured meaning by whether the world agreed. She had seen what happened when truth was denied long enough to become something else. She had watched silence turn into footsteps, obedience turn into echoes, forgotten women turn into witnesses, and she had learned that the most terrifying thing an institution could face was not the supernatural. It was remembrance. With that understanding, Miriam disappeared into the ordinary world, no longer haunted, no longer silent, carrying with her the quiet certainty that some spirits did not come to be feared. They came to make forgetting impossible, and once forgetting ended, the haunting did too. Years later, people would still argue about what truly happened in that convent. Some said it was mass hysteria, born from isolation and fear. Others claimed it was a moral panic exaggerated by rumor. A few whispered about spirits, about bells that rang without hands, about names that appeared in ledgers no one remembered writing. The explanations shifted depending on who was telling the story and what they needed the truth to be. Miriam never corrected them. She understood now that truth did not require consensus to exist. It required witnesses. And witnesses did not need to remain in the place where the truth first surfaced. Her life beyond the convent did not become extraordinary. That, too, felt important. She worked. She listened. She stayed alert to the quiet ways harm tried to disguise itself as order, sometimes in unfamiliar rooms. She felt a brief chill, not fear but recognition, a reminder of what happened when silence was allowed to grow too heavy. She never saw the spirits again, but she felt their absence the way one feels a healed wound, not erased, but no longer aching. The past no longer followed her. It rested where it belonged. Miriam understood something then that she would carry for the rest of her life. The supernatural was never separate from the human. What people called ghosts were often truths that had waited too long to be heard. What terrified institutions was not the dead returning, but memory refusing to stay buried. She had not defeated anything. She had not purified anything. She had simply refused to look away, and that refusal had been enough. Some nights, when the world was quiet, Miriam thought of the women whose names had finally been spoken aloud. She did not pray for them. She did not need to. They were no longer wandering. They had been remembered. And in a world built on forgetting, remembrance was the only exorcism that ever truly worked. The haunting ended not with banishment, but with truth. And once truth was named, the dead could finally rest. So could the living. Miriam rarely spoke about the convent anymore. Not because the memory had faded, but because it no longer needed to be carried outward. What had been integrated did not demand retelling. The story lived in how she noticed small shifts in a room, how she listened when someone hesitated before speaking, how she recognized the early signs of silence turning dangerous. She had learned that most hauntings never announce themselves. They begin as discomfort, as questions dismissed too quickly, as harm reframed until it becomes invisible. The convent had only made that process visible because it had gone on for so long. The spirits were not an anomaly, they were an inevitability. In her quieter moments, Miriam reflected on how close she herself had come to becoming one of them. Not a ghost, in the literal sense, but a presence erased while still alive. A woman who endured without being heard, who vanished administratively, whose name might have been crossed out and forgotten. The thought did not frighten her. It clarified everything. She understood now that the line between the living and the haunted was thin. It was drawn wherever truth was denied long enough to detach from voice and body, where people were told to endure instead of being believed, where obedience was praised more loudly than care. That was why the spirits had appeared as they did. They had not come roaring. They had not come violent. They had come patient. Patient the way truth always was. Miriam carried that patience into the rest of her life. She did not rush conversations. She did not rush healing. She did not rush herself. She had learned that forcing resolution often recreated the same harm as denial. What mattered was allowing what had been buried to surface at its own pace. Sometimes, when she entered old buildings, she felt a subtle awareness, an echo of rooms that had once held more than they admitted. She did not call it supernatural. She called it history. Walls remembered. Institutions remembered. Even when people tried not to. Miriam never became a symbol, and she was grateful for that. Symbols could be simplified. She remained human, attentive, imperfect, awake. That was enough. The convent eventually reopened under new leadership. Some changes were visible, others were cosmetic. Progress was uneven. Memory, once introduced, did not behave neatly. It unsettled. It demanded ongoing responsibility. Miriam did not stay to oversee it. That had never been her role. Her role had been to notice, to refuse the comfort of forgetting, to listen when silence grew too heavy, to understand that what people called ghosts were often the result of truths abandoned halfway. And she had learned something else, something quieter, but just as enduring. Not all hauntings want to be feared. Some want to be finished. By naming what had been erased, by allowing memory to return to the living, the convent had finally made room for rest. Not perfection, not absolution. Rest. Miriam lived the rest of her life carrying that knowledge lightly. She knew now that when spirits appeared, whether in corridors, in dreams, or in the unease people tried to ignore, they were not asking for banishment. They were asking the same thing they always had: to be seen, to be named, to be remembered. And once they were, the world could move forward again, quietly, honestly, awake. And so Miriam let the story end where it belonged, not in explanation, not in spectacle, but in practice. She understood that remembrance was not an event. It was a responsibility that returned quietly, again and again, asking to be honored in small ways, in choosing to listen when someone spoke haltingly, in refusing to dismiss discomfort too quickly, in naming harm before it learned how to hide. The world did not become gentler because of what happened in the convent. Institutions still protected themselves. Silence still tempted people with comfort. Forgetting still offered relief. Miriam expected none of that to change completely. What changed was her relationship to it. She no longer mistook quiet for peace or obedience for goodness. The haunting had taught her that what was buried never stayed buried. It waited. It learned patience. It found cracks. Whether called spirits, memories, or truths, it returned until it was acknowledged. She did not fear that return anymore. If something lingered, it meant something had been left unfinished, and unfinished things could still be tended to. Miriam lived with that understanding, neither haunted nor hardened. She did not carry the dead with her. She carried the lesson they left behind. That silence is never neutral. That memory is not optional. That truth, denied long enough, learns how to walk. And when it does not come to destroy. It comes to be recognized. Once it is, the doors open. The footsteps fade. The air grows lighter. And both the living and the dead are finally allowed to rest. That was how the haunting ended. Not with fear, but with remembrance. Miriam understood that even remembrance had its limits. There came a point when looking back too often risked turning memory into anchor instead of guide. She felt that shift gently, the way one feels when it is time to stop tending a wound and start trusting the scar. The story of the convent no longer needed her vigilance. It had entered the world. What others did with it was no longer hers to manage. She allowed herself to live forward, days filled with ordinary concerns, work, friendships, small frustrations, quiet joys. The absence of haunting did not mean the absence of responsibility. It meant responsibility had found its proper scale. She was no longer carrying what belonged to everyone. Sometimes, when conversations drifted toward faith, authority, or obedience, she listened more than she spoke. She recognized the familiar patterns immediately: the longing for certainty, the comfort of surrender, the fear of standing alone. Miriam did not interrupt those patterns aggressively. She let them reveal themselves. People often learned more from what was not said than from what was argued. She noticed something else, too. Those who had truly listened to the story of the convent never asked whether the spirits were real. They asked why the silence had lasted so long. That question mattered more than any explanation of the paranormal. It meant the haunting had done its work. Miriam no longer dreamed of corridors or bells or shadows. Her sleep was untroubled, not because the past was gone, but because it had been integrated. The dead no longer needed her attention. They had been returned to history, where they belonged. She understood now that the most dangerous ghosts were not those that appeared in the night, but those normalized in daylight. The policies that erased, the traditions that excused, the rituals that demanded endurance without care. Those ghosts still walked freely in the world. But Miriam also knew something hopeful. Once you learned to recognize them, they lost much of their power. The haunting of the convent had not been an isolated event. It was a reminder. A warning written in footsteps and whispers instead of ink. A reminder that truth did not disappear when ignored. It adapted. She carried that reminder, lightly now, no longer as burden, but as orientation. Her life did not circle back to the convent again. It did not need to. The story had found its end not in closure, but in continuation. In a woman who lived awake. In a silence that no longer hid harm. In memory that did not demand fear. And so Miriam lived. Not as someone marked by the supernatural. Not as a witness seeking recognition. But as someone who understood what happened when truth was denied. And what was possible when it was finally named. The footsteps did not return. The whispers did not follow. The bells rang only when hands pulled them. And that, more than any exorcism, was how she knew the haunting was truly over. With time, Miriam came to see that the end of a haunting was rarely dramatic. There was no single moment when the world clearly divided into before and after, no sharp line that announced safety, justice, or resolution. Instead, the end revealed itself through absence, through the quiet fact that nothing followed her anymore. No echoes, no footsteps, no sense of being watched by what had once demanded attention. Life settled, not into comfort but into honesty. Miriam understood now that the convent had been only one place where silence had grown dense enough to take shape. It was not unique. It was simply concentrated. What happened there could happen anywhere obedience was valued more than care, where endurance was praised more than truth, where forgetting was treated as virtue. That knowledge did not frighten her. It grounded her. She lived attentively, but not obsessively. She did not scan every room for shadows. She did not expect history to repeat itself in the same form. She trusted that if something tried to return, whether as unease, injustice, or quiet harm, she would recognize it. Wakefulness had become instinct. The spirits never appeared again because they no longer needed to. They had not come to follow her. They had not come to attach themselves to the living. They had come to finish something unfinished. Once that work was done, they were free. So was she. Miriam never claimed certainty about what others called the paranormal. She did not need labels anymore. Whether the spirits had been echoes of trauma, manifestations of collective guilt, or something truly beyond explanation no longer mattered. What mattered was what they revealed. That silence has weight. That memory resists burial. That truth, ignored long enough, finds another language. And she had listened. As years passed, the story of the convent faded into something less sensational and more enduring. It became a reference point, a quiet warning passed between people who knew how to listen, not a legend, but a lesson. Miriam aged like anyone else. She changed, she softened, she lost things, she gained others. The haunting did not define her, it clarified her. She had learned, once and for all, that the most dangerous thing was not spirits walking at night. It was people learning how to look away during the day. And so she did not look away. That was the life she chose. Not haunted, not heroic, just awake. And that was enough. In the end, Miriam understood something simple and difficult at the same time. There would always be places where silence tried to settle in again, not as footsteps, not as whispers, but as habits. Habits of dismissal, habits of obedience, habits of looking away just long enough for harm to feel normal. The world did not need ghosts to repeat what it already knew how to do on its own. Miriam did not live in fear of that truth. She lived with awareness of it. She learned to recognize the early signs, when people stopped asking questions, when discomfort was reframed as weakness, when endurance was praised more loudly than care. Those were the moments that mattered. Those were the moments where the haunting, if it were to return, would begin. Not in walls, but in people. And so she stayed attentive. Not vigilant in a rigid way, but present. Present enough to pause. Present enough to listen. Present enough to name what others hesitated to acknowledge. That presence did not make her extraordinary. It made her responsible. She did not seek out broken places. Broken places found her naturally, the way they always did. And when they did, she did not arrive as a savior or a witness to spectacle. She arrived as someone who had learned the cost of forgetting. That was enough. The convent became a story told quietly, stripped of drama over time. The spirits were debated, doubted, reinterpreted. Some insisted they had never existed. Miriam never argued. Whether the spirits were believed did not change what they had done. They had forced remembrance, and remembrance had changed everything that mattered. Miriam lived the rest of her life without being followed by echoes, without needing to justify her clarity, without waiting for permission to see what was in front of her. She carried no relics from the haunting, only its lesson, that when truth is denied long enough, it does not disappear. It returns in forms people cannot ignore. And when it is finally named, truly named, it no longer needs to haunt. The bells rang when they were pulled. The corridors stayed quiet. The night remained only night. And Miriam, no longer needed by the past, walked forward into an ordinary life made honest by memory, awake, unafraid, and free enough to remain that way. Years later, Miriam would sometimes be asked how she knew the haunting was truly over. She never answered with certainty. Certainty had once been the language of control. Instead, she spoke of something quieter. She said that when the truth was finally spoken, it stopped demanding attention. When memory was allowed its place, it no longer needed to intrude. What remained was not fear, but responsibility. And responsibility, unlike terror, could be lived with. She explained that real endings did not announce themselves. They revealed themselves through normalcy, through nights that stayed silent, through institutions forced to carry their own history instead of burying it, through people who learned to ask different questions. The convent still stood. Its stones had not changed, but something fundamental had shifted. The walls no longer carried secrets heavy enough to press outward. The past had been returned to time, where it belonged. Miriam understood then that hauntings were never about the dead refusing to leave. They were about the living refusing to remember. Once remembrance happened, Fully, honestly, the world recalibrated. Not into justice, not into perfection, but into truth that no longer needed to scream. And so the story did not continue as a warning or a legend. It continued as a practice of listening when silence grew uncomfortable, of naming what others preferred to soften, of refusing the comfort of forgetting. That was how Miriam lived until the end of her days. No longer haunted, no longer followed. Just awake enough to know when truth was asking to be seen and strong enough not to turn away. Miriam's life toward its later years grew smaller in ways that felt intentional, not diminished, concentrated. She chose fewer words, fewer explanations, fewer battles that existed only to prove something. What remained was clarity, the kind that does not argue for itself, the kind that simply stands and lets others decide what to do in its presence. People who met her late in life would never guess what she had witnessed. They saw a woman attentive without intensity, gentle without submission, someone who listened without collecting confessions, someone who did not rush to comfort discomfort away. That steadiness was not natural. It had been learned. Sometimes, when conversations drifted toward authority, faith, or obedience, Miriam would pause in a way that made people lean forward. She did not interrupt. She waited until the silence did its work. Only then would she speak, briefly, carefully, often with a "hey" question instead of an answer. Those questions lingered longer than statements ever could. She never returned to the convent, not because she feared it, but because it no longer required her presence. The work there had been finished the moment memory was allowed to breathe. Returning would have been nostalgia, not responsibility. Miriam had learned to tell the difference. As her body slowed, her attention sharpened. She noticed the weight people carried when they believed endurance was their only option. She noticed how often silence masqueraded as peace. These patterns never left the world. They did not need ghosts to survive. They only needed habit. But Miriam also noticed something else. She noticed how easily the cycle could be interrupted. One question asked honestly, one moment of hesitation before compliance, one refusal to explain harm away. These acts were small. They did not look like justice. They did not feel heroic. But they changed the shape of rooms. They shifted conversations. They loosened what had been held too tightly for too long. That, Miriam understood, was how hauntings truly stayed gone. Not through ritual, not through denial, but through attention sustained long after the noise faded. In her final years, Miriam slept easily. Not because she had found certainty, but because she had made peace with uncertainty. She had learned that the world did not need her to solve it, only to remain honest within it. When she died, there were no bells rung in, secret. No footsteps echoed in empty halls. No whispers returned to unfinished corridors. What remained were people who remembered her, not for what she confronted, but for how she listened. And that was fitting. Because Miriam's story had never been about ghosts. It had been about what happens when silence is finally interrupted, and how, once that interruption is honored, both the living and the dead are allowed to rest. The haunting ended. The remembering remained. And the world, imperfect and unfinished, continued, just a little more awake than before. In the quiet after Miriam's passing, nothing strange occurred. No signs, no echoes, no disturbances seeking interpretation. Those who had known her noticed something subtler instead. Conversations slowed. People paused more often before dismissing discomfort. In moments where silence once felt easier, someone would speak, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes imperfectly, but speak nonetheless. Miriam had not left instructions. She had left a way of paying attention. The convent eventually became just another building, its story folded into archives, footnotes, local memory that grew thinner with each generation. Some details were lost, others blurred. That was inevitable. What mattered had already moved beyond walls and stone. The haunting had never belonged to that place alone. It had belonged to a pattern. And patterns, once seen, could not be unseen. Miriam's life did not echo loudly through history. It did not need to. She had learned what most institutions never did. That truth did not require amplification to endure. It required space. It required honesty. It required people willing to stay with discomfort long enough for it to speak. She had done that. And because she had, others learned, quietly, unevenly, imperfectly, that silence was not neutral, that obedience was not synonymous with goodness, and that remembrance was not a threat, but a responsibility. Nothing followed Miriam into the night. No ghosts, no unfinished business. Only the steady absence of what once demanded attention. And that was how the story ended. Not with fear, not with spectacle, but with a world slightly less willing to forget. There was nothing left to resolve. The world did not pause to acknowledge what had been learned, and it did not need to. Life continued the way it always did, unevenly, imperfectly, forward. What changed was not the surface of things, but the way people moved beneath it. Those who had crossed Miriam's path carried something quiet with them. Not a doctrine, not a warning, a sensitivity, a slight resistance to easy explanations, a hesitation before calling silence peace or endurance virtue. They did not always know where it came from. They did not always recognize it as inheritance. It was simply there. The haunting never returned because it no longer had work to do. What had demanded to be seen had been seen. What had needed to be named had been named. What had been buried had been returned to memory. There were still injustices, still institutions that protected themselves, still places where obedience was rewarded more than care. Miriam's life had not solved these things. It had never tried to. It had only refused to participate in forgetting, and that refusal proved contagious in the quietest way. Not as a movement, not as a rebellion, but as a shift in how people noticed. If the spirits had taught anything, it was this, that truth did not need to haunt forever. It only haunted where it was denied. Where it was acknowledged, it rested. Miriam had understood that before anyone else around her did. She had lived accordingly. And when her life ended, there was nothing left behind that needed to follow. No echoes, no footsteps, no unfinished corridors, only a world that in small and nearly invisible ways had learned to listen sooner, and that was enough. The haunting ended where it always does, not with banishment, but with remembrance. And once remembrance remained, the silence lost its power forever. There was finally a point where even continuation became unnecessary, not because the story had run out of words, but because it had reached saturation. Everything that needed to surface had surfaced. Everything that needed to be said had already found a voice, not in narration, but in consequence. The convent no longer needed guarding. The memory no longer needed defending. The silence no longer needed breaking. What remained was ordinary life, carrying a quiet alteration. People still made excuses. Institutions still protected themselves. Harm still tried to disguise itself as order. But something subtle had shifted. Forgetting no longer felt innocent. Looking away no longer felt neutral. Silence, once comfortable, now carried weight. That weight was the legacy, not Miriam's name, not the convent's scandal, not the question of spirits or the supernatural. The legacy was awareness. And awareness, once awakened, did not vanish when stories ended. It moved on, into conversations where someone paused before complying, into rooms where someone named discomfort instead of swallowing it, into moments where obedience was questioned. Not loudly, not dramatically, but honestly. That was how the haunting truly concluded. Not with an ending scene, not with closure wrapped in certainty, but with a world that could no longer pretend that silence was harmless. Nothing followed after that. No sequel, no return. Only the quiet truth that when remembrance is allowed to stay, nothing needs to come back to haunt anyone ever again. The story did not continue because it needed more events. It continued because life does. After the haunting, after the remembering, after the last whisper faded into ordinary sound, the world did what it always did. It absorbed what it could. It resisted what it could not. And then it moved forward, carrying fragments of both. Miriam's absence was not felt as loss, but as space. Space where people hesitated before enforcing silence. Space where questions were no longer treated as threats. Space where obedience stopped being automatic and became a choice. Nothing supernatural filled that space. Only responsibility. That was the quiet truth the haunting left behind. Not fear of what might return, but awareness of what never should have been buried in the first place. The spirits had not come to linger. They had come to complete something the living refused to finish. And once that work was done, the world was left with itself. No echoes to blame, no shadows to fear, only the uncomfortable freedom of knowing that silence can be chosen, knowing that obedience can be refused, knowing that memory, once allowed, changes the shape of everything that follows. The convent became a place again, not a pressure. The night became just night. The bells rang only when hands pulled them. And the story, having said what it came to say, finally rested. Not because nothing else could happen, but because nothing else needed to. What remained was a world slightly less willing to forget, and that was the truest ending it could ever have. What followed was not another chapter, but an aftertaste, a subtle one. Long after the convent returned to being just stone and schedule, long after Miriam's name faded from conversation, something remained altered in the way people carried themselves. It showed up not in stories told, but in instincts formed. Someone paused before dismissing a complaint. Someone chose to listen instead of correct. Someone felt discomfort and did not immediately call it weakness. No one traced these moments back to the haunting. They did not need to. Causes mattered less than consequences now. The world had not learned compassion. It had learned attention. And attention, once learned, was difficult to unlearn. There were still places where silence thickened, where obedience was praised as virtue, where endurance was mistaken for holiness. Those places would always exist. But now they were less stable, less sealed, less certain they could bury things forever. Because somewhere in the collective memory, faint but persistent, was the knowledge that what is denied does not disappear. It waits, it adapts, it returns, unless it is named, unless it is remembered. That was the final truth the haunting left behind. Not a warning of ghosts to come, but a reminder of what happens when people refuse to see. And so the story does not end with fear. It ends with responsibility. Responsibility carried quietly, unevenly, imperfectly, by ordinary people, in ordinary moments, choosing not to look away. No footsteps followed, no whispers returned. Only the steady, irreversible fact that once remembrance takes root, silence never fully regains its power again. And that is where the story rests. Nothing else rose from the silence. And that, finally, was the sign. Not absence as emptiness, but absence as completion. The kind that follows when something long denied has been fully acknowledged and no longer needs to insist on itself. The world did not feel healed. It felt honest enough to continue. People still failed one another, Institutions still faltered. Memory still eroded at the edges. But forgetting was no longer effortless. Silence no longer felt weightless. It carried a question now, faint but persistent. What is being left unnamed? That question lingered in rooms long after conversations ended. It followed decisions quietly. It surfaced. When obedience was offered too quickly, when endurance was praised too easily. It did not accuse. It reminded. The haunting had taught no one how to be good. It had taught them how to notice. And noticing, once learned, altered everything that came after. It slowed the rush to explain. It disrupted the comfort of dismissal. It made room for truths that did not arrive politely or on schedule. Miriam's life did not echo as legend. It did not need to. Her presence had done its work without spectacle. The spirits had done theirs without violence. Together they had proven something simple and difficult at the same time, that what is buried does not stay buried, that what is remembered does not need to return. So the world went on, quieter in some places, more careful in others, and wherever silence tried to settle too heavily again, it no longer found the same welcome. That was the end. Not because nothing could follow, but because nothing needed to. In the years that followed, no. One spoke of the haunting as something unfinished. When people did remember it, they did so the way one remembers a hard winter, not with fear, but with an understanding of what it took to survive it. The story was no longer about spirits or corridors or bells. It had become something quieter, more difficult to dismiss. It was about what happens when silence is allowed to rule for too long, and what becomes possible when it finally breaks. The convent aged, stone weathered. New hands rang the bells. Old names faded from common speech, but not from record. They existed now where they should have always existed, acknowledged, imperfectly understood, but no longer erased. Miriam's name appeared rarely, and when it did, it was not elevated. She was not framed as a hero or a martyr. She was remembered simply as someone who noticed and refused to stop noticing when it became uncomfortable. That was enough. Nothing else followed because nothing else needed to rise. The dead were no longer restless. The living were no longer asleep. And the world, unchanged in so many ways, carried one irreversible difference. Silence was no longer invisible. It could still exist. It could still tempt. But it could no longer pretend to be harmless. That was the final inheritance of the haunting. Not fear, not belief, but awareness. And with awareness, the story, at last, was complete.